Hi everyone. So today the movie we're going to be talking about, if I was to condense it into a nutshell, it's what if a high schooler who was obsessed with Samuel Beckett and unironically thought Neil Breen was a genius decided to write their own pretentious version of American Gods, but had zero budget for CGI and could only afford Eric Roberts for an afternoon. That's this movie, Exceptional Beings. This is a January 2023 release, written and co-directed by Nadia Anthony. I'm going to put the name here because I'm sure I'm screwing it up, and I'm not as bad as this movie is. I'm not trying to mock anyone's name or to mock them as an artist. Um, this is also so he wrote or this person. I'm not sure if it's a male or female, uh, but it was also directed by Christian Kazida. Kazidi. Again, I'll put the name here. I'll just put all the names here because, yeah, who knows how bad I'm going to mispronounce everybody except for Eric Roberts. The film stars Rachel Thundat, um, Ciara Carter, Dane Oliver, and Eric Roberts. That's the only recognizable name in this cast. If you saw him, you'd probably recognize him. Um, it's generally a very young cast and it's a very low budget film, so it makes sense that he's really the only name. It's okay. Uh, and I'll say this later, but none of the acting was actually really horrific in the film. It was actually, with the right director, I think a lot of these people could have pretty steady careers.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So here's the plot synopsis according to the director slash writer on IMDb. Um, It is two supernatural beings begin to question their godhood when they encounter a human being, an ordinary woman with an uncanny essence, who doesn't conform to their thousands of years of knowledge about humanity. They journey through her existence as it relates to their desperate needs to understand answers to questions they never believed existed. According to one review on this I read, it's a prequel to a novel that the person whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce again, a novel they wrote called Godhood. Um, I don't know how to read, so I'm never going to read it.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Um, it's been rated, as of the time that I'm recording this, it's been rated 11 times on IMDb and has an 8.1 out of 10. This is probably because of multiple accounts by the writer and director. Let's be really honest. Uh, the same with the Rotten Tomatoes, where it's at 100%. It's like the opposite of a review bomb. The one review on IMDb is so obviously the writer or director trying, because it says things like you have to do Google searches and rewatch it multiple times to understand. Um, it's yeah, it's kind of pathetic. Um, on Rotten Tomatoes, though, there are two critical reviews, and this is nothing to do. This is a sidebar, nothing to do with the movie. It's just annoyed me. There's one positive critic review I could find by this guy from Film Threat, um, and his profile picture. He must have found the most punchable version of his face he could use for his profile pic. It's so bad. I'll put it here. Um, and he seems to give highbrow and slow burn horror unfair bad reviews. And it's fine if you don't like those movies. I mean, like Andrew, the co-star, my co-host on the regular program, like he doesn't really like horror movies. I don't, he still gives them a fair shot. He says, okay, I don't like it, but it's still a good movie. I can see why other people like it. This guy doesn't seem to understand that. He gave Bodies, Bodies, Bodies a 2 out of 10. This is an A24 slasher flick from last year. It's not a 2 out of 10. He gave Skinamarink a zero point 0.5 out of 10. These are both like movies that have generally very high opinions and have high Rotten Tomato scores. It's okay if you don't like these movies, but you're hating on them for no reason. You're giving them a low score almost because they're well recognized. And from what I'm seeing of him, um, and I'm not an expert film critic, film reviewer, and I understand I have room to grow. But I just want to say this, that it looks like Film Threat is a shithole, and I'd never trust that site for reviews based on what little bit I've seen here. Um, so now Hydro Man Ran has started their first online view, albeit it's probably going to be one-sided because nobody's ever going to watch this. So let's go to my analysis of the film.
I don't know what you're talking about.
First, the acting, like I mentioned above, isn't bad. With what these actors had to work with, I think they did a fine job. They appear to understand what they're saying, even though I don't understand what they're saying. They speak with conviction. There are actually moments where the actors are charismatic and compelling. It's not Oscar worthy, but for a low budget indie release like this, it's fine. It doesn't detract from anything most of the time. I have to say, I think they did a good job.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Another positive thing is when they aren't in weird CGI spaces, some of the cinematography isn't bad. Um, there's some good lighting and there's some shot compositions that at least show an understanding of being interesting. It's when you're watching it, there's a few scenes. There's one scene where the childbirth scene that I mentioned um, in the plot, where there's just this really harsh light casting across her, and her other side is in shadows, and it's just a really interesting layer. It feels natural to the setting because she's in an apartment and the light's coming in through the window, and it doesn't seem to change from scene to scene. So they actually got the continuity correct in there, and it's actually looked good. But now I guess it's really to kind of the negatives of the film, which is really the meat of this.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Some of the editing is really awkward and bad, especially when it comes to the CGI fight scenes towards the end. It's you can't understand what's going on. I will say that some of the editing and some of the fighting when they're not in these CGI spaces isn't the worst thing. And actually, for this low budget of a film, it works. It's fine. It's not that bad. Um, but whenever it has to do with CGI, it's really bad. And then there's one scene where Athena goes to see Apollo, and at the beginning of that scene, all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, there's this weird. It's almost like how Ocean's 11 did some editing like this, where there's crossbars and everything's kind of fading into each other, and you have like two cameras, and one will split off, and you see like both cameras go in different directions, but you're seeing them on screen, and they're just doing like horizontal and vertical breaking of the frame, um, which in a movie it can be interesting, and it kind of gives some energy to kind of a frenetic sequence, or when multiple things are going on that you need to pay attention to. um, but it was kind of it didn't really have any point here, and it wasn't really done well. So when you have your two cameras, the important things need to be in frame, centered in frame, even as you break apart or even as one slides away. You need to have the critical things in frame, and they didn't quite get that, where parts of things were cut off. Um, Also, another thing with the editing, there's when Hermes takes Mina Bahari, a teacher at Jockston Middle School, when he takes her back in time, or to the memory, whatever was really going on in that scene, I'm not 100% sure. Um, I noticed whenever they were talking um, to the characters, or when the characters were talking, and you'd have like the one shot focused directly on them. It was going back and forth shot. Um, Excuse me for forgetting appropriate dialogue here. Yeah, I'm a real film critic. I'm shitting on other people. Um, but I'll do this here. So like their heads were like that. Like the top of their heads were completely cut off. They weren't frame center. But as I was looking at it, I was like, well, if you take black bars off because they were cropping it to give it this really cinematic look. You know, their mouths are in the center of the frame, so that like it's not a bad framing, but the way they cropped it down, it looked really awkward. And as I was going back through and rewatching it, I noticed that it's just that scene. That scene for some reason, they bring the cropping, they bring the black bars in and crop the frame even more than normal. And it was just kind of a weird scene. I don't understand why they did that. It really, I don't know if something was in the frame. I don't know what was going on there that made that decision. Maybe they got a boom mic in one shot, and that was the only way to crop it out, and they wanted it to be consistent throughout that entire scene. Um, just looked weird.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Now for my two big. So most of the time the editing's fine, right? But there's two really bad things in this film, um, and that's the CGI and the writing. Now, first, the CGI. This isn't always critical. You can have okay CGI, digital blood and digital explosion, and it isn't too bad. It might be slightly noticeable that they're CGI or that it's, not the best CGI in the world, but if the movie moves on, it doesn't linger on it. Um, uh, Generally, the viewer doesn't either. They might be like, "Oh, that was a little weird, awkward scene," but if you're making a good movie, okay, we can get past it, we can move on. A good viewer can. There's some jerks out there, probably like those guys at Film Threat, who probably couldn't get past this. But this movie has entire scenes um, set in CGI scenarios where the actors are on blue or green screens, and it's noticeably bad. It's laughably bad at a few points, and it's ongoing for the entire sequence. The entire scene is just bad. Um, and it's incredibly detracting from the film. I couldn't focus on the inane dialogue. We'll get to that in a second, because of the CGI. There's one moment where Poseidon shows up, and it's played by Eric Roberts. He's wearing a bad beard, and he looks like he's wearing like a Japanese kimono. Obviously filmed on a different day when no one else is there. Um, but the characters are all surrounded by a wall of water, which Poseidon is coming out of. Uh, and there's this really harsh, extreme blue light on all the characters. And as I was watching the scene, I kept on seeing this blue light. So the wall of water it's blue because it's water, and that's generally what we think water to be the color of, even though it has no color. Um, and you're seeing this harsh blue on them, and all I could think of is I was like, did they have too harsh of a light on the blue screen, and it's reflecting back onto these characters? It's just so weird. But later on, like in all the other CGI scenes, there's there's no harsh blue light that I could detect there that was noticeable. So I'm assuming they're thinking that the blue light makes it look like they're surrounded by water. Even though it's only harsh, it's really harsh from one angle, so it doesn't entirely work. It really just looks like they did a bad job of lighting the blue screen that day that they were doing the filming. Um, Very distracting, very detracting from the entire scene. Then there's a scene where they go to the desert and they fight towards the end. They use some stock background that has camels walking across it. So the entire scene, there's this endless string of camels in the background of these actors. Um, they're walking kind of janky. Uh, it also kind of looks like even though they're on a blue screen, it looks like they're filming day to night or filming uh, yeah, day for night, and it's just distracting and detracting. Um, in the final battle, they're in this black globs filled hellscape. Um, I don't know where the scene was supposed to be taking place, but the camera stutters and the camera shakes, and you see the actors kind of moving up and down, but the background stays steady in the background, and it's just a really it's that scene where even if the background is CGI and bad, it's that scene that it's the moment that immediately takes you out of it because the background doesn't change, but the actors are all of a sudden just jerking up and down on there.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
I don't know what you're talking about.
They also don't appear to be in contact with the ground, like there's no shadows or anything like that. Really, really simplistic CGI things that you can do just to make your film a little bit better. So that's distracting and detracting. There's also this pyramid transition. Holy shit, guys. Blew my mind. I don't know. I know exactly what the scene was trying to do and what they were trying to show us, but it was so bad. They show the outside of a pyramid, and then all of a sudden they go to this really weird CGI where they're like going through a maze almost inside of the pyramid, and then all of a sudden it's like it looks like they're in Mortal Kombat and with an Egyptian type background. So bad, so weird. Um, and then the first moment that I knew what I was in for with this movie. At the very beginning of the movie, our protagonist runs away and she's running through the streets, and the streets are kind of wet. And I noticed that there's kind of slight puddles of water in the street. You know how water pools in streets, not puddles, it's just like shallow little pools. And there's digital raindrops throughout it, and it's obviously digital raindrops, like they don't really move right, and they aren't needed for that film, or they aren't needed for that scene. You could have just said, "Oh, it was raining, but now it's not. It's fine. It was raining earlier in the night. It's okay." I wouldn't have even noticed, but because they put these really awkward digital raindrops in, it just drew my eye straight to it. It was so bad. Um, and so now we're going to talk about kind of a combination of the writing and the CGI. Because there's part of the writing that goes hand in hand with the CGI. And when you're writing a script, you need to understand your budget constraints. You need to understand and take into consideration when writing your scenes what your budget might be. It's really similar. Years and years ago, I tried and failed to make a comic book. It's not a good comic book. If you want to go back and find it and try to read it and trash it, that's fine because it probably deserves it. But one thing I realized when making that is even in the comic book where you don't really have any budgetary constraints, you can kind of do anything you want, you still have to put constraints in based on what your artist can do. And you need to take that in consideration whenever you're making a movie, especially in this case where the writer and the director are the same person. You kind of should know, you know, what CGI artist you're going to be using, what they're capable of doing, what your budget is to do this, um, and and write your scenes to fit that. And they don't seem to understand how to do that. It's okay to have a few janky little shots here and there, but there are like the entire third act is just janky CGI, and it's very distracting. And there's a good chance that my entire understanding of the film was removed by all this horrible CGI. I was so focused on, "Well, why is that? What's happening? Why is the camera moving but the background's not moving?" That I missed some important piece of dialogue, and maybe I missed the entire point of the film. So maybe my entire critique that I'm really about to get into about the writing, maybe that's all false because your CGI was so bad. And you can write multiple endings of your movie to account for potential different budgetary constraints. You could have written it where it wasn't all weird and CGI and things like that, and it would have been fine if you had had something small, um, but not distracting. That I think it would have made a much better film here.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So that's my film class for today on writing. Um, but really with the writing, what it really comes down to is that the script is just horrible. Um, the sentence structure is fine, right? And I was vaguely able to determine what was happening and who the characters are. But it's also so pretentious. It's vague and intentionally esoteric. There are moments I felt like two characters are having two different conversations. They would veer off into a side tangent that was supposed to somehow connect back to the thesis of the entire conversation or some great epiphany, but it was all meaningless droll. Uh, there were moments that truly felt like they were supposed to be having dramatic moments with a great epiphany, but it was just something like, you didn't tell me Hades had wings, and the actors sold it like it was this great soap opera moment, where they get the water splashed in the other person's eye, but it was nothing. And I'm gonna tell on myself here. It seriously reminded me of back when I was in college. I took a theater class and I first read Endgame by Samuel Beckett. Um, and I tried to write some profound but utterly sophomoric and incoherent play. Um, that's probably what bothers me about this movie is that it reminds me of the type of stupid shit I wrote 23 years ago. I thought it was so smart and clever. I mean, luckily for me, I had a teacher who I gave my work to, and she read it and was just brutally honest and just told me like, this is meaningless. Like, what do you? This doesn't mean anything. Like, this is stupid. Like, you have a lot of work to do to get better. Um, Luckily, it wasn't for a grade. Another issue I have with the writing is the tone of the script. It it flops back and forth between quirky commentary after a few pretentious scenes. There's one where there's two men talking about how to get their political candidate to win, and that scene really made me think of Neil Breen. It's just this political commentary out of nowhere that has no attachment at all to the rest of the film. And then there's one where there's two working women um, in the police station who were talking about one of them. John tried to pay one of them with a Barnes and Noble gift card, and it's very weird and disconcerting and disconnected. These seem to be out of nowhere, and they're very jarring to the tone of the rest of the script. It seems like they're wanting to make some sort of social commentary, which I guess is horrors can't read. I don't know, but they don't flow with the rest of the film. It's almost like the CGI, where all of a sudden it's just like shakes you and be like, "Whoa, what's happening here?" Um, they feel like they're from an entirely different film, almost like the writer wrote them in a different film. It was like, well, I love these scenes, I got to put them in here because this other movie is never going to get made. There's really so much more I can cover with this film, and I wanted it to be a short one. And based on my time right now, I don't. This might end up being almost 30 minutes long, which is way too long to talk about this film. Um, I won't say I wasn't entertained watching it. I was engaged. You're trying to figure out what's happening, but I don't think I was engaged the way the filmmakers intended. Um, this actually was kind of an enjoyably bad film, in my opinion. I do recommend watching it if you like that. If you like that type of thing, it's up to you whether or not you want to spend money on it. I'm sure if you want to wait a few months or a year, it'll probably show up on Tubi or Pluto. Um, yeah, but I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 5. Thanks.
I don't know what you're talking about.